This message is about Ezekiel's temple. It's universally, in Christianity anyway, called Ezekiel's temple, but the Bible never calls it that. But it is the temple that Ezekiel describes. And Ezekiel spends something like 9 chapters describing the details of the physical construction of this temple and also how operations are to work inside of it. And it's a very interesting study, and that's what we're going to look at today. So this temple is given in such precision that you could build it right now. So the dimensions are given for everything that it describes, and it uses long cubits for its measurement. Now the cubit could be done in 2 different ways. It could be done as the short cubit, which is about 18 inches in our measurement system, or it could be done as the long cubit, which is 20.4 inches. And in this case, it's done as 20.4-inch cubits. And a reed is also used as a measurement here, and the reed is 6 long cubits. So those 2 measurements are kind of the measurements that everything is done in here. But in this study, we're going to look at it in units that we understand more, feet and primarily feet, I think. So as I said, it could be built in our time. It has some special structures to it that would be complicated to build, but they could be done in our time. They couldn't have been done that many years before now. Not only do you need to have good concrete to make tall, straight-walled buildings, you need to have some other construction materials that are capable of doing that in a safe way, and also in a long living way. So it's something that is only recently something that we could have built. It could have been built back in Israel's time. They just simply didn't have the construction materials for that. So one thing to note out of that, and you'll see that in some videos we're going to be looking at here, is you're going to see a blue line through there. Now that's a stream of water that comes out, and it's very interesting because of the way it's described in Ezekiel. It starts as a very thin stream going out from the Holy of Holies, and as it goes further and further out, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes a huge, mighty river that travels down to the Dead Sea. And it actually is enough of a river that it takes the Dead Sea, which is right now a dead sea. Nothing could live there because of the heavy saltiness that's in it. And it converts it into a living sea where fish could live. It freshens the water that completely. And so this is a physical, literal body of water that flows. The odd thing about it is that it starts as a small trickle coming out of the Holy of Holies and grows as it continues on, which rivers don't do. So watch for that. You'll see it there. And there's going to be one place you're going to see it in the video where it's going to look like this blue stream is going up into the sky. Don't be confused by that. That's not happening. It's just the way the drawing looks there. So this Ezekiel's temple is different in a lot of ways from temples that were described before in the past, and tabernacles as well. It is very large compared to those. And we're going to look at size comparisons here in just a moment. It's going to be 875 feet on a side. So it is large compared to things that we recognize like a football field. And in fact, it has a wall around it that is even larger than that and makes it a truly gigantic structure. So watch for these things as we go through this. So the temple size comparisons, there have been various temples that I mentioned before. There was, let me get my laser pointer out. There was the original court of the tabernacle, which was what the Israelites traveled through the desert with. And it was, as you see there, about 150 by 75 feet. Now let me point out something in the measurements here. The person who did this chart did a good job, except that he used the short cubit. And so he's going to have numbers for feet that are shorter than the long cubit that we're talking about here. And we don't actually know if short or long was used for this, but we do know because specifically for Ezekiel's temple, it says that the long cubit was used and or will be used because it's a future temple. It doesn't exist and has never existed. So this 750 by 750 feet that you see up here is not going to be correct for that. So in any case, they're not that far apart and we can still use them for comparison size. Okay, so the original temple that they carried through the desert, through the wilderness, was about that size, and this is an American football field for comparison, so it's 100 by 50 feet. So that gives you a size comparison. And so you can see that the temple was a good size. Like a football field is not a small thing. So you can see that the temple that they set up in the wilderness was a decent size, but still not like a football field. Now, when the temple was rebuilt under David's design and Solomon's building, it was built to a larger specification that David had gotten from God. And so it's a larger complex, and it gets to be much closer now to the size of an American football field. It's something like 2/3 the size, or 3/5 maybe, of the size of an American football field. And so it's larger at that time, and it's organized a little bit differently. Things are built differently. Ultimately, what happens with Solomon's temple is the Babylonian Empire conquers Israel, and the temple, the temple is destroyed, and it is knocked down. And later, when they return from Babylonian rule, the Israelites rebuild it again to what it was here as Solomon's temple. But then later on, under Herod, King Herod of Jesus' time, he builds a new area around it, and he sets up what's now called the Temple Mount, which is a huge area around it. So he doesn't really change the temple much. He kind of adds onto the building and makes it more elegant and beautiful. But the temple part of it itself doesn't change much, but he adds additional courtyards and additional space to it and makes it into a much larger complex. And so now it's under Herod's temple, it is much larger than a football field, like 3 or 4 football fields in size, and so it's quite a large complex. But Ezekiel's temple is far larger than that. It's like 3 or 4 times again the size of Herod's temple, and it's different in many ways. Just at a glance here, you can see that there's a lot more structures in it. There's a lot more things. Uh, Everything is larger and bigger, and there are lots of differences. And so we're going to be looking at some of those differences here, especially in the videos. The videos are going to describe all the details that you see drawn out here for Ezekiel's temple. So how large is it? It is so large compared to the place where the temples have always been. And remember, the temples have always been on what God called his holy hill. And that's been important to him from the very start. From back at the time of Abraham, they believed that the sacrifice, or the almost sacrifice there, would have been on God's holy hill. That's where it would have been done. And so that leads on through time, and David recognizes that as being the place to build the temple. God shows him that, and so on and on. This holy hill in Israel is the place where God wants his temple to be built, and it always has been built. And so we expect that's the same place this new one is going to be built. But there's real problems with building it there. One of them is that this river that's going to flow out of it can't get to the Dead Sea from there right now. That just isn't possible because Jerusalem is essentially surrounded by hills that are taller than it. And so water doesn't flow uphill, so it's not going to be able to get there. And there's another problem with that that's perhaps even bigger than that. Its size is so big that it's going to start overlapping off of the hill that it's on right now, and go down into a valley. And it's quite a deep valley too, not a trivial thing. And the design here for the temple area would be overlapping that and going downhill. So it would be hard to believe you'd even be able to build it according to the specifications that are given here in Ezekiel. And moreover than that, God wants a wall around that temple complex that will separate the people from the temple complex by 250 feet. So the total size of the complex, including this wall, is a mile by a mile. So it's huge. That would be covering a big part of Jerusalem as it stands right now, and it would be covering valleys and hills and other things like that. So the way it stands right now, it doesn't seem possible for it to be built on that holy hill of God's. But there are reasons to believe things won't be the same at that time. Zechariah tells us about a great earthquake that's going to strike that area. And it's going to be such a strong earthquake, it's going to split the Mount of Olives, which is a decent mount. Well, we would call it a hill here, I think, but it's still a huge stone hill. And Zechariah says this stone hill, which is, let me just go back from memory, I think it's something like 700 feet above the temple complex, or maybe it's just 600, something like that. But that gives you a rough idea. So this large hill is going to be split in half, and half of it's going to move north, and half of it is going to move south, leaving a gap between it. And this gap is where we expect the water is going to be flowing through from the Temple Mount down to the Dead Sea. That's a possible path that you could make. Now, if you split that Mount of Olives in half, there's now a path because the Dead Sea is sort of just downhill from there. So that becomes believable after that it could happen. Um, other jurisdiction or other descriptions of jurisdiction at that time could include the Temple Mount, which would be much higher now. And so there's some, the Bible doesn't say it explicitly, but there's a good reason to believe that it is raised up above where it is currently. There's verses that talk about that being raised up, and we wonder if that's a metaphorical or symbolic meaning, or whether it's literal. But with all of the other changes that are happening with the Mount of Olives splitting, and that's a literal split for sure, with that splitting, we can expect that the whole area is going to be struck by the earthquake in a significant way, and it could restructure that whole area. It could raise up the area that is currently where the Temple Mount is. And it was also at the same time devastate that whole area and knock down any buildings that are on the Temple Mount currently. And all of this would make it possible to build this larger temple on that site. And so Ezekiel talks about this law of the temple, and he says all of the surrounding area on top of the mountain will be most holy. And so right now, no one would call this what God calls his holy hill. We would never call that a mountain, but it starts to be called a mountain after this earthquake. And right now, Solomon's temple covers it, and it was a small temple. And right now it's underneath the Temple Mount that exists currently in Israel. And so somewhere underneath that is the peak of God's holy hill. What we would never call that a mountain right now, but Ezekiel does, and he talks about it as this whole surrounding area around the mountain would be most holy, and it would be on top of the mountain. So there's a lot of reasons here to expect that whole area of Jerusalem is going to be devastated by a huge earthquake and changed structurally in the ground. Things are going to go up and down, and it'll be not the place it was before. And that will make it possible to rebuild as God has planned through Ezekiel here. Okay, so who is going to be building this? And Ezekiel doesn't mention that, but Zechariah does talk about that a little bit. He says, "Then say to him, Thus says the Lord of hosts, Behold, a man whose name is Branch, for he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he who will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne." There's some important things to see here. Priests never had thrones in any past temple. A priest never had a throne, but this priest is going to have a throne, and that's a subtle hint, a wink, wink, nudge, nudge hint of this priest is not going to be like the other priests. This priest is also going to be a king, and he's going to have a throne as kings have thrones. So, and we get who that is, but this could mean that the Messiah will create it himself. He's certainly capable of that. Or it could mean that he will be the manager of the people who will create it. But in either case, it will be either him or under him that this is created. And God, it's worth saying here that God had planned to build the first temple in Jerusalem himself. Moses pleads with God after the sin of the golden calf to let the people build the temple for God when they get to Israel, to the promised land is how they knew it at that time. And Moses is saying this because it had been God's original plan for him to build it himself. And so Moses says to God that it would be good for the people to have a part in it, to have a part in the construction of it. It would mean more to them if they were involved in the construction of it. And God agrees to that. Now, of course, God knows all time. And so it's no surprise to him that Moses is asking for this. And God has actually planned it this way that the people will be the ones who build the temple. But so God had originally, though, been thinking that he would create it. But he does agree to go with what Moses says. and let the people build it. And so ultimately, as I said before, he gives the plans to David, and then David gets all the materials together and gives them to Solomon, and Solomon oversees the building of the temple, the first temple in Israel. So we're going to be looking at some videos, as I mentioned before. This first video is a really good way to understand the primary buildings that Ezekiel describes. And so it's going to take you, these videos are going to take you through the chapters of Ezekiel, and they're going to show you where all of the measurements that Ezekiel gives are in the temple and what the temple is going to look like. And it's going to be shown as a three-dimensional model. So that makes it really easy to understand how this looks, and also how different it is from any previous temple that has ever existed. Now, it has some things that are the same. It has an outer court and inner court and Holy of Holies. Those three things are still existent in this new temple. And it has a sacrificial altar, but it makes it clear that there will be animal sacrifices going on, but that may be more subtle than we're thinking about. And the temple also faces east, which it did in the past, so that's the same too. But it's different in a whole bunch of other ways. There's no mention of the laver, the big tub for washing. There's no mention of the table of showbread. There's no mention of the menorah, which is the lampstand which was inside of the inner court. But the menorah is a critical part symbolically, because it is a symbolic reference to the Holy Spirit in us as well. And so it's interesting the menorah would be missing, or at least not mentioned. The golden altar of incense is gone, or it certainly doesn't show up there, not mentioned at all. The veil into the Holy of Holies is not a veil anymore. You'll see in one of the videos that it's become a door, a folding door, in fact. And the Ark of the Covenant isn't mentioned either. And you'd think, wow, if anything is going to be mentioned in this temple, it's going to be the Ark of the Covenant. So there are certain things that are very different and conspicuous by the fact that they aren't mentioned. But there are lots of things that are also still very similar here. So that was a great video. And we're going to go pretty quickly into the next video. The next video is going to cover chapter 41 and describes the main temple building inside and out and some other things like that. In Moses' temple, the priests were allowed to go inside into the temple part itself, the building structure itself. But the very innermost Holy of Holies, the chief priest was only allowed to go there once a year on a particular day of the year. And that all seems to be different here. Some things that we have talked about already about the heavy veil that separated this Holy of Holies from the rest of it isn't in Ezekiel. It's instead this bifolding door. And so that's quite different here. And so watch for these things when you see them on the video. And we also see that things are different in who can go into the Holy of Holies, but that's more in the details of Ezekiel. Okay, and we'll go into the next video again pretty quickly here. This one is going to cover chapters 42 and 43. And as part of 42, it's going to show some of the other buildings that are kind of in behind the temple proper. And it's going to talk about that outermost wall that I mentioned, the one that is 2,500 feet away on all sides from the center of the temple complex. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on as well. And so that's what chapter 42 describes. Chapter 43 of Ezekiel talks about the Son of God arriving at the east gate and at the altar. And you're going to see that depicted here. Now, there's going to be a little bit of artistic license used here because some of the descriptions aren't that easy to understand. And so the artists do their best to understand it here. But the artist has done a pretty good job here, I think. And this is where Ezekiel talks about wheels within a wheels, and we'll get with that a little bit later on here. But this wheels within wheels idea you're going to see in the video of God arriving there. And later on after that, we'll show you some other pictures about what this vehicle would look like that God arrives in. Now remember, um, the East Gate was special, even in the previous temples. It was a reserved gate, reserved for God. And in this temple, it's the same thing. And only the Son of God is allowed to enter in via this East Gate. The other two gates are for ordinary people to enter in. But that one gate, the East Gate, in the Old Temple, it was called the Golden Gate as well. That was reserved for God to enter, and only God. Okay, so you saw the part there where God arrives at the temple, and it happens so quickly in that video, you almost need to run it a few times to follow it. Um, and the description isn't in these chapters. Let me clarify that. The description of the vehicle that God comes in on, his ride, is not described in this part of Ezekiel. It's described in an earlier chapter of Ezekiel, I think maybe chapter 1, and then again later on. So the artist here has used the description from the earlier chapter and put it in here to show you. But nonetheless, the same idea is here, because in chapter 43, it says God arrives like he had been seen earlier. So had been seen earlier, chapter 1 and the other chapter. So his ride has a number of things that are very characteristic of this chapter or this vehicle. It has a throne, a seated throne where God is seated, and around that there's a rainbow of light around that throne, And below that throne and the rainbow, there's a transparent layer of a certain thickness. And so the throne is kind of riding on this transparent layer, whatever the transparent layer is. And below that transparent layer, there are four angels. And these four angels are the ones who motivate the vehicle to move. They're the ones who make it go in the directions that it goes. And beside each of these angels, there's a wheel within a wheel, and that has received more attention than it deserves. And we'll talk about it just right away here. And so these wheels are covered with eyes. Now, it's important to understand here that this is a symbolic description of something that we couldn't see with our own eyes. So these angels that are described and the wheels that are beside them with the eyes on them are not meant to be literal things. And so the artists here have used this symbolic description to show you this vehicle coming in here. But what you're seeing is the symbolic description of something we can't see and understand being brought into a physical description. So it's a mismatch. It shouldn't be done this way, but there's really no other way to do it. And so I hope that makes sense that while the rest of the temple that's described in Ezekiel is all physical, real dimensional things, God's ride and God are not physical things, they're spiritual things. And the descriptions of these angels and the whole rest of it are symbolic descriptions to give us understanding, but they aren't literal, physical. They are that way in physicality. It's complicated. Okay, so this Ezekiel wheel within a wheel idea has been misused by people forever. And it's kind of sad that it's not understood any better than that. There are some people who claim it's UFOs, that these circles within circles are actually UFOs. Well, that's nonsense. And we'll look at a really good picture here in a moment of an artist's reconstruction of what Ezekiel described. And again, remember that this is a symbolic description. So people have wanted to make this wheel within a wheel mean whatever they want it to mean, and they've twisted it around in various ways, and UFOs are just one of those ways that people have done that. But those are all wrong. These are symbolic descriptions of spiritual beings, spiritual matters, and so. But nonetheless, it's good to understand this as a picture because it helps us to get some of the symbolic meaning from that. And so this picture that follows is a good representation, and you can find lots of bad representations of what Ezekiel says, but this is a good one that is very literal. And so what you see here is the throne up above that transparent layer, and you see the rainbow of color around it, and below that transparent layer, you see the angels with their wings, two wings up and two wings down is what you're seeing there. And below that, you see these wheels within a wheel represented as this way, and that's probably a pretty good way to represent it too. And you see that there are eyes along the surface of that. And again, these are symbolic descriptions of spiritual things. They're not meant to really be understood literally, but this does give us some idea of what Ezekiel is describing, seeing symbolically.